He was born into poverty, a peasant from the eastern provinces. Yet he was to rule for almost 40 years. He would undertake the final bid to reunite the Roman world. But in doing so, the Emperor Justinian would be remembered as the last of the Romans.
The city which had once conquered an entire world has been conquered. St. Jerome.
Petrus Sabatius, later to become the Emperor Justinian, was born in the early 480s. He was the son of peasants from the province of Thracia, modern Serbia. Life was harsh. The empire itself was undergoing hard times. For over 2 centuries, Germanic peoples had been pouring across the weakly defended frontiers along the rivers Danube and Rhine. The Western Empire had been unable to fend them off. Only a decade before Petrus's birth, the once great capital, Rome, had fallen to the Goths.
When Justinian was born, there was no Roman emperor ruling in the West, and Rome was in the hands of the Goths. In fact, most of the Western provinces were being ruled by barbarian kingdoms, if you like to call them that, various dynasties. North Africa was being ruled by the Vandals. So the focus had shifted to the east.
The eastern half of the empire had been strong enough to survive barbarian pressures. At the heart of this empire was the city of Constantinople. As a youth, Justinian dreamt of escaping from a life of provincial poverty and making the long journey to the capital. His uncle, Justin, had left Thracia in this way and had become an important officer in the Eastern Emperor's palace guard. Justinian was grateful when at last his uncle summoned him to join him.
Justinian arrives in Constantinople from one of the most backward parts of the Roman Empire, from provincial Thrace. It would be a bit like a Welsh or Scottish Highlander coming to London. And Justinian comes to Constantinople as the relative of a man who is already quite important in imperial terms. So he comes from this provincial backwater right into the heart of things, to the ceremonial heart, the pageantry, the display of this great city.
Since the Emperor Constantine had declared the city the new Rome 200 years earlier, Constantinople had prospered. With a population numbering 500,000 people, it sat on the border of Asia and Europe, the very heart of a divided empire.
Constantinople is now the center of the Roman world. Constantine's foundation has now become the capital. Power and wealth are concentrated now in the east, 500 miles east of Rome on the Bosphorus. This is where the center is. Of course, in many ways, these people are very Greek. They don't speak Latin, they speak Greek. They don't dress in togas, they now wear Greek-style tunics. I think a Roman would think that Constantinople was very Greek. Those in Constantinople, although they're in some senses the Greek East, still call themselves Roman, still use old Roman institutions, still feel themselves very much part of a Roman Empire.
When Justinian reached his teens, his uncle Justin became head of the palace guard. Justinian took up a comfortable post under his command.
Though they are called soldiers, most of them are merely civilians in splendid uniforms and perform purely decorative functions. Agathias.
He didn't stay a Thracian peasant for very long. He may have been born as such, but he rose, like many people of his kind did, through the army. But the army was a route to power, and had been for a long time.
As a member of the military guard, Justinian is part military, but part also courtier. He joins in the high life of the city. He's close to those in power. He has an opportunity of being part of their power networks. It's between the two, but an advantageous position.
Under his uncle's protection, Justinian enjoyed the privileges of court life. As the years passed, he slowly moved up the imperial hierarchy. In July 518, when Justinian was in his 30s, the ruling emperor, Anastasius, died. There was no clear successor, and the court of Constantinople was dark with intrigue and plot. After a night of secret meetings and lavish bribes, the will of the imperial guard proved decisive. It was Justin, Justinian's uncle, who was declared the new emperor.
When Anastasius dies and there is a disputed succession, it's unclear who is going to succeed as emperor. And in the discussions, in the public clamour in the Hippodrome, Justinian, who is a member of the imperial bodyguard at this time, is influential.
His uncle Justin now took control of the city. Justinian stood at the shoulder of the new emperor of the Roman world.
Justin was uncouth and boorish. His nephew Justinian used to manage all the affairs of state. Procopius.
Justinian remained his uncle's favorite. It was not long before the childless 68-year-old emperor adopted his nephew as his son and heir. Born Petrus, he was renamed Justinian.
Justinian is the person who will continue the family of Justin. And family continuity, promoting the interests of the family, has been important throughout the Roman Empire. Here is the future for him, the future of the family, the future of his power.
Justinian was the emperor's right-hand man. He sat on the imperial council and represented his uncle at state events. Reaching 40, he was elected to the highest political post, the consul.
Formally speaking, a consulship in the late empire is purely honorific, but that shouldn't lead us to devalue its power. What it has is great symbolic importance. Being consul allows Justinian to hold magnificent games. Being consul marks him out as heir apparent. He is now the powerful man in Constantinople to watch behind the emperor.
As consul, he alone could put on lavish games at the Hippodrome. This was Constantinople's great racetrack, which held a crowd of 250,000 people.
Public entertainment in the Roman world changes in the late 5th, early 6th century. That traditional forms of entertainment like wild beast fights, gladiatorial combats have been prohibited. And the single most popular form of public entertainment that is left is chariot racing that takes place in the hippodromes located in the major cities of the empire. Chariot races between 4 teams: the blues, the greens, the reds, and the whites.
Each team attracted enormous groups of followers. Often lawless, poor, and violent, these circus factions effectively controlled the city. From within one such faction, Justinian met an exotic performer called Theodora. She was little more than 20 years old, and to the amazement of his fellow courtiers, Justinian fell passionately in love.
She came from a family of performers in the circus, in the hippodrome. Her sisters performed. Her father kept animals. He kept the bears that performed in the hippodrome. She was, let's say, an actress or a striptease artist, perhaps. I don't think she was a prostitute, but no doubt she did a bit on the side. And she captivated Justinian when he was a very important person. It was against the law for a senator to marry an actress, but the law was changed, and he married Theodora.
The aristocracy of Constantinople was appalled. He was expected to marry within the nobility, certainly not a circus performer half his age. The historian Procopius recorded the slanderous stories that were spread about her.
Theodora would spread herself out and lie face upwards on the floor. Servants would sprinkle barley grains over her, and geese trained for the purpose used to pick them off one by one. Often she would go to a bring-your-own-food dinner party with 10 young men or more, all at the peak of their physical powers and with fornication as their chief object in life. I would lie with her fellow diners in turn the whole night long and reduce them all to a state of exhaustion. Procopius.
Justinian was unconcerned about the public scandal his marriage had caused.
It's difficult in some ways to get a sense of Justinian's character, but I think when one looks at the relationship between Justinian and Theodora, one starts to see something of the real emperor, someone capable of affection, capable of a real partnership.
In 527, Justin died. Justinian and his new wife Theodora were escorted to the royal box in the hippodrome as emperor and empress.
You hide in your apartments in case men discover that you are mortal. Synesius.
In appearance he was short, with a good chest, a good nose, fair-skinned, curly-haired, round-faced, handsome. John Mallalus.
Justinian retreated into the private, secretive world of the imperial court. Fearful of assassins, the Eastern emperors had become increasingly isolated from the people, cloistered within the luxurious marble-clad palace.
Constantine had built a palace in Constantinople, but of course it had grown, so that by the time of Justinian it must have covered a very large area. It's a whole complex of rooms, audience chambers, private apartments, inhabited by a whole range of state officials, eunuch slaves, servants, all kinds of attendants. And it had a private passageway to the hippodrome so that the emperor could go into his royal box there.
Justinian appeared rarely in his imperial box. Adorned in silks, gold and gems, surrounded by his elaborately dressed guardsmen, eunuchs and priests, he struck an impressive but distant figure.
Court ceremonial in this period is already highly complex. It takes a skilled courtier to work out what is correct royal etiquette. Justinian and Theodora are both sticklers for court ceremony. That's partly because they're concerned with their safety, but it's partly also because both of them were from insignificant social backgrounds, and they needed to use the rhythm and the structure of court ceremonial to emphasize their position and to keep a barrier between themselves and the Roman aristocracy and potential assassins.
Senators, once Rome's ruling officials, were forced to prostrate themselves before their emperor and his wife.
The Senate sat merely as a picturesque survival, without any power either to register a decision or do any good, assembling for the sake of appearance. When they came into the presence of Justinian and Theodora, all of them had to fall on the floor flat on their faces, stretch out their hands and feet as far as they could, touch with their lips 1 foot of each of their majesties, and then stand up again. Procopius.
This public humiliation fueled the private resentment of Constantinople's nobility. The attacks on Theodora in particular became increasingly bitter.
To her bodily needs, she devoted quite unnecessary attention. She was in a great hurry to get into her bath, and very unwilling to get out again. Though she strayed thus into every path of self-indulgence for so great a part of the day, she thought fit to run the whole of the Roman Empire. The emperor took no notice at all of what was going on.
But within the confines and secrecy of the palace, Justinian was initiating many grand and ambitious plans.
Justinian certainly did have some very big projects. His first big project was the codification of Roman law. This had not been done. There had been a law code in the 5th century, but many laws had not been included in it. And he set up a commission, and the work was finished with several major publications in an amazingly short time. And through that, Roman law came to Western Europe. So that was his first agenda.
Justinian is a man who believed in the rule of law. Law, the organization of law, was of vital importance for Justinian. And that is something which both Caesar, Julius Caesar, and Augustus would have appreciated. Justinian believed in controlling society.
In the 2 centuries since Constantine's baptism, the Roman Empire had been transformed from a pagan into a Christian empire. And Justinian was eager to enforce strict moral codes upon his people.
The emperor issued a decree prohibiting gaming in any city, for some gamblers who had been discovered in Constantinople had been indulging themselves in dreadful blasphemies. Their hands were cut off, and they were paraded around on camels. Many homosexuals were arrested and died after having their genitals amputated. From then on, there was fear amongst those afflicted with such lust. John Malalas.
Justinian attempted also to clamp down on the lawless activities of the circus factions, but he had pushed too far. After 5 years in power, mass rioting broke out. large areas of the city were looted and destroyed by fire. Huge crowds gathered at the Hippodrome, shouting Nika, victory. Justinian could also hear them calling for his death. He prepared to flee, but his Empress Theodora held her nerve.
May I never be separated from the purple. If now it is your wish to save yourself, O Emperor, there is no problem. For we have much money, and there is the sea, here the boats. However, having saved yourself, consider whether the day will not come when you would gladly exchange that security for death. As for myself, I approve a certain ancient saying that royalty is a good burial shroud. Theodora.
Theodora was very determined, very ambitious. She was going to be in charge. And if she wasn't going to be in charge, nothing else mattered. Either empress or dead is effectively what she said to Justinian in the crisis of the Nika riot.
Most of the city centre was being looted and burnt down. Fortified by Theodora, Justinian turned to his friend and fellow Thracian, the leading general Belisarius, to crush the riot. Belisarius led his army against the rioters and showed no mercy. Thousands were slaughtered as he regained control of the burnt-out streets.
It was a riot. It was a major urban riot. There were many urban riots in the 5th and 6th century in Constantinople and cities in the east. They were rather unstable places, these cities, because they had rather a lot of people who were, in our modern sense, unemployed, but and who really hadn't got very much to do, were living off the city for what they could get.
The Nika riot, I think, taught Justinian a very important lesson. No matter how popular he seemed, no matter how loud the crowd shouted, nevertheless, at the end of the day, at the last resort, the Roman emperor's position still depended on the sword.
Justinian has made the state more illustrious by expelling barbarians. Procopius.
Justinian had regained control of his capital. But to consolidate his grip on power, he needed military success abroad. The Eastern Empire had been fighting the Persians for decades. But under Justinian, the campaigns had stalled. In search of glory, Justinian looked to the old western provinces which had fallen into the hands of barbarian kings.
Overseas adventurism is the last desperate gamble of bankrupt regimes throughout history. And Justinian is in serious trouble. His offensive war against Persia started well, but failed miserably. His tax-collecting policies have proved extremely unpopular. He's just faced a riot in Constantinople, which two reliable commentators tell us left 10 to 20,000 people dead and burnt down the ceremonial center of the imperial capital.
Justinian bought peace from the Persians with massive amounts of gold. He then mounted an expedition, headed by Belisarius, to reconquer the lost Roman province of North Africa.
He needed to re-establish his position. And so he sent this expedition out to try to reconquer North Africa from the Vandals. And apparently everyone was very frightened that this would not succeed.
North Africa, although conquered by the Vandals, still remained a very Roman province, and the Vandals had rapidly Romanized. In a sense, it was not a foreign place that Belisarius went to conquer. That perhaps is neatly illustrated by a lovely story concerning the Vandal king Gelimer. Besieged and realizing that he was going to be defeated, he asked the general for three objects: a loaf, a sponge, and a harp, A loaf, he explained, because he had not eaten properly since the invasion had begun. A sponge to dry his eyes because he was weeping with the loss of his kingdom. And a harp to accompany himself on the ode that he had written on his downfall. Now that's the story of a highly Romanized Vandal. That's no barbarian story.
Belisarius had only a small army under his command, but within 2 years he had overwhelmed the Vandal kingdom. He returned to Constantinople in triumph. The defeated Vandal king was paraded in a great procession.
Belisarius displayed the spoils of war in the midst of the city and led a procession in the ancient manner, until he reached the imperial box. And there was booty, thrones of gold and carriages, slaves, much jewelry made of precious stones, golden drinking cups, all the royal treasure amounting to an exceedingly great sum. Procopius.
When the emperor and the empire were successful, there must have been phenomenal adulation of the man who had brought this about. So that in Constantinople, within a couple of years of the massive loss of life occasioned by the Nika riot, you have the flip side of that, the tremendous triumph in which the Vandal king is brought walking into the hippodrome and is forced to prostrate himself in front of Justinian against the background of tremendous cheering from the crowds.
Justinian's gamble had paid off. The success in North Africa encouraged a more momentous decision. He decided to send his armies to reconquer the rest of the Western Empire.
Whether Justinian aimed to reconquer the Western Empire from the moment he took power or not is the $64,000 question. Most people assume that he did. In my view, he did not. It's only after he's phenomenally and, I think, unexpectedly successful in North Africa in defeating the Vandals that little ideas, little lights come on inside his head and he starts to think, we can pretend we're reconquering the empire.
His first aim was to take back Rome and Italy from the Goths.
What's always important to remember about the Goths is that they are not beer-swilling barbarians. These are men in some ways who are more Roman than the Romans. They're very careful to wear togas, to use old republican officers. Italy had remained a very Roman place, in some senses more Roman than the Greek East and Constantinople.
Belisarius and his troops landed in southern Italy and began to press northwards. The Goths slowly retreated. In AD 537, Belisarius retook the ancient heart of the empire, the once great capital, Rome. Back in Constantinople, an elated Justinian decided to mark the reconquest of Rome by completing the construction of Santa Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, which had been destroyed in the Nika riots. Justinian had hired the greatest architects of the day to build a new church of unsurpassed grandeur.
Justinian, I think, was a great builder and wanted to be seen as a great builder. A great builder of walls and a great builder of churches. Defense of the empire and its spiritual health were safe in his hands.
The emperor saw the rebuilt church as a symbol of a reinvigorated, reunited Roman Empire. The emperor was wrong.
our generation shall see no end to such ills. Agathias.
In the year 540, Belisarius was advancing towards the Gothic capital at the northern Italian city of Ravenna. Then he received orders from Justinian. He was to return to the east. The Persians had broken the peace.
The great threat to Justinian's empire remains Persia. The great Persian empire is sitting in the wings, waiting to take advantage of any opportunity. I think a bit like the old Cold War confrontation between America and the Soviet Union, that neither side thought it could conquer the other outright, but any moment of weakness was there to be exploited.
Yet when Belisarius arrived in Constantinople with the spoils from his Italian campaign, there was no public triumph to honor his victory. Justinian had begun to fear the popularity of his successful general.
Belisarius, of course, is one of the most successful of Justinian's generals. That's what makes Belisarius very dangerous. Justinian, of course, belonged to a dynasty which had come to power as a result of a military coup. Belisarius' success naturally made Justinian nervous. It's not at all surprising that he undercut Belisarius, that he shamed him. Any wise emperor would have done the same, faced with such a successful general.
In the following years, Justinian ordered Belisarius back and forth between Italy and Persia, with never enough men and materials to wage either war decisively. The Persians took advantage of the confusion. Many of the great Roman cities of the East were sacked, most notably Antioch. The magnificent buildings were looted, and the city's wealth was carted back to Persia. In 543, during this time of crisis, a deadly, unseen enemy struck at the heart of empire. A new disease, the bubonic plague.
Pestilence swept through the Roman Empire, wiping out most of the farming community and leaving a trail of desolation. At Constantinople, they dug pits all around the city and laid the dead there. But later on, those who were making these pits, no longer able to keep up with the numbers of dead, mounted the towers of the fortifications and filled practically all the towers with corpses. As a result of this, an evil stench pervaded the city, especially whenever the wind blew fresh from that quarter. Procopius.
Justinian himself became ill, and the court waited for him to die. But remarkably, the emperor recovered. He was soon well enough to bemoan the catastrophic loss of so many subjects.
Something like 200,000 people are said to have perished in Constantinople and in the east, and this meant loss of revenue because taxpayers are dying, and we can see that the government was very worried about that because it immediately started to legislate and say that the heirs had to pay, and if there were no heirs, then other people in the family had to pay these taxes. I think we do see a government under pressure.
The plague was a disaster. 40%, roughly speaking, of Mediterranean manpower was wiped out. It had a serious effect on the economy and the taxation base.
Justinian issued orders that tax dues were to be severely enforced, especially among the rich. He sent out tax collectors, men like John Leadenjaws and Alexander the Scissors, into the countryside. They were universally hated. Increased taxation stirred up discontent in the provinces. They resented their money being used to pacify foreign tribes that threatened the empire's borders.
Like an overflowing river, he daily ravaged his subjects. But the whole flood swept straight on to enrich the natural enemies of his country, Procopius.
Tax collection was further strengthened. Every province was expected to pay, no matter how poor the harvest, nor how virulent the plague. If a farmer died, his neighbor was expected to pay for him.
The Roman Empire was significantly dependent upon taxation, and it's certainly true by the 6th century, given the number of wars that are needing to be fought and the vast expense of defending the frontiers, that the empire is very gradually beginning to be bled dry.
Justinian was now in his 60s. He had ruled for 20 years. The empire he so recently believed had been restored was cracking apart. He was facing a further threat on the neglected northern border. Immense armies of Slavs and Bulgars were pouring into the empire, devastating towns and villages. They reached the walls of Constantinople and were only repelled at great cost.
At an earlier date, the emperor had become almost the first of the rulers of Constantinople to be emperor of the Romans in fact as well as in name. He had accomplished these and similar feats when he was in the full vigor of youth. But now, in his declining years, when old age was upon him, he seemed to have wearied of the vigorous policies and to prefer to play off his enemies against one another, and, if necessary, to coax them away with gifts. Agathias.
Meanwhile, in Italy, Justinian's armies rolled backwards and forwards inconclusively. Rome itself changed hands 5 times and suffered irrevocable damage. As the years passed, Justinian continued shoring up his frontiers, building and strengthening fortresses from North Africa to Syria. But the enemies also lay within. At Constantinople, Justinian was assailed by his long-standing aristocratic opponents. To them, he remained a peasant upstart who had made a whore his empress. To the general population, he was a tyrant, draining them through unfair taxation. A further moral clampdown reinforced a mood of bitterness and discontent.
Justinian gave orders that all places of entertainment should be closed down. Both in private and in public, there was grief and dejection. All laughter had gone out of life. Procopius.
I think the moral clampdown is principally a way of trying to add some kind of moral rejuvenation to the empire, a feeling that it is right, that Christianity can still provide unity. It's a way, I suppose, of trying to assert the Romanness of the rule and the rightness of Justinian's regime.
But the glories of his regime were over. The future held only decline.
He was devoting his time for the most part to the doctrines of the Christians. Procopius.
In 548, Justinian's partner, Theodora, died. She had been of vital support to him and his regime.
Justinian was grief-stricken at Theodora's death by cancer. He never, in a sense, really recovered. it forced him further into the palace, made him more inaccessible. I think that in the last 10 years of Justinian's life, we see in his seclusion not senility, but genuine grief at the loss of a partner whom he had deeply loved.
We have a very hostile picture of Justinian and Theodora from contemporaries, and they represent them as demons in human form. They were perceived as being responsible for wars which killed millions of people in North Africa and Italy and other places. Of course, any autocrat is going to have that sort of reaction and response. I think as he became older, Justinian became saddened and disillusioned, certainly after Theodora died in 548.
Isolated in his palace, Justinian contemplated his failure. His armies in Italy had ironically done more to damage Roman life there than the Romanized Goths. Western and northern provinces were as stretched as ever. The hippodrome beneath Justinian's balcony lay empty. No more triumphs, no more games. A shadow fell over the city as all waited for Justinian to die. He was now an old man, devoting his time to the church. On the 14th of November, in 565, the 83-year-old emperor died.
Justinian, I think, can be fairly said to be the last of the Romans, because on Justinian's death, the hope of reunifying the empire dies with him. The hope of re-establishing a political state around the Mediterranean basin, around what the Romans simply called Mare Nostrum, our sea, that hope fades.
Justinian was at the centre of power in Constantinople for around about half a century. That is a very long time. And during this half century, he has to face a range of challenges that ultimately bring about the transformation of the classical Roman Empire into the post-Roman world, the Byzantine Empire in the east, the various successor kingdoms in the west.
No other ruler would unite the empire again. Only 3 years after Justinian's death, the Lombards, another Germanic people, poured into the exhausted Italian peninsula. It was lost to Roman control forever.
I think with the Caesars, what we see is a struggle to maintain a unified empire around the Mediterranean, both politically and culturally. And I think with the last of the Caesars, Justinian, that ambition is forever lost. The Islamic invasions will make North Africa politically separate and culturally foreign. With the last of the Caesars, we move from an idea of classical unity to an idea of medieval diversity. We move from a world in which Roman emperors would have felt familiar to a world of new kings and new conquerors, from a world of the Caesars to a world dominated by Mohammed and Charlemagne.
The Persians remained a menace on the eastern frontier until they succumbed to a new force, the Arabs, with their new religion, Islam. Within a century, they had also conquered North Africa. Yet a reduced Eastern Empire was to survive for many centuries. It was not until 1453, 800 years after the death of Justinian, that Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks.
In my view, the main legacies of the Roman Empire fall in the field of religion and law. The late Roman Empire saw the creation of Christianity as we know it, essentially. Most of the doctrines, practices and structures of medieval and then modern Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity are created in the late Roman period.
The Roman Empire is part of our history. The Roman Empire is what made European history. Law, for example, Roman law is fundamental to much Western European law, although not English law, of course. Architecture was a fundamental legacy of the Roman Empire. The spread of Christianity owes a great deal to the existence of the Roman Empire. But I think the great achievement of the Roman Empire is that it was a very successful exercise in the management of vast territories by a central government, and that has never been surpassed.
Justinian was the last emperor to rule over a united Roman Empire. It was an empire that survived 1,000 years, and its legacy resonates still. So too does the legacy of its Caesars. History has seen many imitators who have styled themselves, for good and ill, Tsars, Kaisers, Emperors. But for boldness, determination, ruthlessness, brutality, and imagination, few have matched those called Caesar.